notes. Okay. Hi. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Let's see. What are we doing this time? We are talking about the Tuf Voyaging Prologue, which is the prologue to the story, The Plague Star. So we're not totally going to start with The Plague Star this evening, but as we were last time with Sand Kings, we're here to entice you to read because Tuf Voyaging is, well, that's a reread I've been wanting to do for a long, long time. So thank you for being here. I am Leech. I'm the crazy one that has read all 80 of George's stories and come up with Martinworld that drives me crazy every day. You don't need to read all of these stories to understand Ice and Fire, but it helps if you're looking for a direction. And this is my co-host tonight. You guys might know him already. It's Shatterjack. It's Jeff. I call him both. So
either works.
Either works. Jack, do you want to take a second to say something about yourself? Like, when did you first discover George works?
I've been a sci-fi, etc. fan for a long time. All the canonical works. I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, whenever the show started to take off, I heard more and more about it. Took a while to get emotionally invested in that particular thing because I've been burned by some other franchises. Some people will say, were you book first or show first? I was basically wiki first, where as soon as it became, people that I respected began to say that it was something worth thinking about, and it was held up to rereads and that sort of thing. I basically slurped the whole Westeros wiki into over the course of like a 3-day weekend, basically read through all that, familiarized myself with all the stuff and the background in the world, and then dove into the books. I still haven't completed all of the show. There's some bits of it that I haven't seen. I've seen most of the show, but that's just the kind of person I am. So spoilers are not really of a concern to me, and for this topic and this channel in general, these are spoilers universal, because we are going to not deal with anything sequentially.
Right.
In this particular case, there's some interesting things. Obviously, this is a prologue, so it's very short, and most of the things that we'll be discussing are world-building kinds of things and thematic things, not specific plot elements. And that's what we're here for.
Right. And to add on to that a little bit with spoilers, the reason why we can't avoid spoilers is, like Jack was just saying, we're trying to world build within the world, within the writing world. So many things happen across many, many different stories. So we have to refer to other stories on occasion to help make our point and to be thorough. Okay. So yeah, we spoil everything, and we are going to start by spoiling this prologue for you, and we're going to sort of tackle it as like a 3-part story or a 3-part play, just so we can address each action. So some of the themes and topics across Tuf Voyaging that we also see in Song of Ice and Fire. Tuf Voyaging is, in effect, it's a sub-series set within George Martin's Thousand Worlds universe, which that writing universe consists of about 25 stories in total. They began around the mid-70s, and they were repackaged in the 80s. And I think up until like almost 1990, he was writing stories in this Thousand Worlds universe. Ice and Fire is not in Thousand Worlds. Ice and Fire is not secret sci-fi. So I just want to get that out of the way first. And what we're talking about here, themes, archetypes, story progression, things like that. So we actually, as readers, should thank Tuff for coming around for a few reasons. Oh, Amy Blackfire's here. Hey, girl. Hi. I'm glad you stopped by. So it's just getting going. Haviland, Tuff, we have to thank for George continuing his writing career, especially one of the editors at Baen Books, Betsy, I think is her name. I don't remember her last name, but she's really the one that kind of needled at George. Okay, let's get this. Let's get this story going. We want more. We want more. We want more. So, in doing so, George took the original Haviland Tuff character and story, and he rewrote him to be more sympathetic and expanded his world, added it to his own existing Thousand Worlds universe, and that pulled George out of a writing rut, because he's at one point in Dream Songs, George says, "My career is littered with the corpses of dead stories. But then comes Tuff. Haviland Tuff, ecological engineer, master of the Ark, and protagonist of Tuf Voyaging, which is either a collection of short stories or a fix-up novel, depending on whether you're a critic or a publisher. 'Twas Tuff who broke my series bugaboo for good and all, and opened up the gates for Wild Cards and A Song of Ice and Fire." So, yay, Tuff. So then he goes on to explain Tuff a little bit more, and he says, "As a writer, I was still dreaming of establishing a popular long-running series of my own. I had an idea that I was certain could sustain I had an idea that I was certain I could sustain as well. It was 1975, and ecology was a word on everyone's lips. It seemed to me that a series about some sort of biogenetic engineer who moves from world to world, solving, or in some cases creating, ecological problems would offer no end to the story of possibilities. The subject matter would allow me to explore all sorts of juicy issues." So yeah, he wrote himself out of a bag by coming up with Tuff. But he does go on to say, for Tuff, he was a cat lover, he's a vegetarian, he's big and bald, he drinks mushroom wine, and he likes playing God. He's a fussy man and formal who has long since veered past idiosyncrasy and in and out of eccentricity. And of all of the characters George has come up with, he says that of all of my protagonists, Tuff is the least like me. So it's funny to read this story and then know George to the level that we do know him, like through his writing, through his interviews. And then he goes on, he says, "So I wrote The Plague Star, the tale of how Tuff came to be the master of the Ark, followed by the Suthulm triptych, which gave the book a spine. Baen published Tuf Voyaging in February of 1986 as my fifth novel. My fifth novel, some say, although I've always counted Tuf Voyaging as a short story collection. In my own mind, Black and White and Red All Over, which is up there somewhere, will forever be my fifth novel, broken, unfinished, though it is." Yes. So, yeah, Tuff is very much like Varys in space. But we'll get to that. Anything else you want to add at this point, Jack, for the development of Tuff, or?
Just to say that this is, as we said in the last stream, that George's native mode really is kind of like episodic Twilight Zone episodes, whatever you want to call that, weird fiction with recurring characters as a frame device. That's kind of when he runs out of all other ideas. That's the mode he writes in. So he had all these ideas, and like Woe and Shade from Sand Kings was supposed to be this way, and you can sort of think about all of the stuff in the Thousand Worlds and the stuff that's in Ice and Fire as a similar thing, where you could extract any of the characters from Ice and Fire, and they have like comprehensive stories that could stand alone as a novel if you wrote them that way. They just all happen to co-inhabit the same world.
Yeah.
That idea of you set up your chessboard and you move characters through it is an idea that appeals to him. That is the seed that, you know, he starts to imagine characters as they bounce off these other things that exist in the world. They go to different places that represent different things, and they interact with other people, and that changes them. And like a pinball, they, you know, move through the world. This is exactly that. All of the there's not a lot of plot to the prologue. There's character building, and there's information about the world, about the Thousand Worlds, as a backgrounder. A lot of his stories have 3 layers, like something like Dying of the Light, where you have a personal progression of the individual characters within the story. The second tier down is a little bit of background about that particular story or that particular world and how the stage was set for that story to happen in that world ahead of time. And then you also get at the lowest level, you know, like the Frangans are something that appears in a bunch of different stories. That's like a cosmic level. This is just a feature of the Thousand Worlds. Those are his little turtles or his chess pieces that he's moving around.
Yes.
And in this one, you're going to get a little bit of character development, not much because it's so short, but most of it is going to be about the stage setting and how the Thousand Worlds fits together in general. So it is a good kind of primer on that aspect of it.
Yes. You mentioned Woe from Woe and Shade from Sand Kings. They're another sort of like trader or dealer that George said he was going to have go essentially like explore his world. That's another series that he said that he didn't get to finish. I would die if I could get some more Woe and Shade stories. And my next, it's so close to being finished. It's so close to being finished. But the next book club reread, because Tuf Voyaging is going to it's long. It's going to have to be spaced out. So the next individual story reread is Night Flyers, which has also a lot of thematic elements that are shared heavily with the Plague Star. Not so much in this prologue, but in the Plague Star. So, you know, keep an eye out for that as well. That's a really fun story. Okay, so some of the spurring incidents, some of the Act 1 type of stuff that we see in this prologue. We open with a type of long night. There is an astronomical herald that is associated with the plague. That is something that George probably has known for a long time, drawn from real life with comets in fiction as powerful forces. They are capable of causing disaster, but they are some sort of harbinger. And this is something that he's done with not just this plague star, but also with the Red Comet and Ice and Fire, and also the Vulcan, which is a night flyer, as I was just talking about a second ago. So we have the opening of a type of long night, starts in the night. We're told that trading bases have been abandoned, which is not unlike what we see happening with the Free Folk, because the Ice Dragon others have been moving in, which is related to the Harangans, the Harangan mines, which is mentioned in this story and mentioned across most of Martinworld. The Harangans really are prototypes for dragon controllers, is the easiest, shortest way I'm going to put it right now. This is, that's the Red Comet and the Vulcan. And then the main character is Rarick. And he is a trader that works across the galaxy and is now on a planet where everyone and everything is dying out. The other main race that we don't really encounter them, but that we see or hear about primarily in this story are the Haroon, which were basically like the whites or the Unsullied or whatever. They were the battle warriors, the mobiles, if you want to go back to Singing Kings.
They're a warrior caste.
They were the warrior caste, and they were controlled by the mind. And they were the slave race to the Harangans. The plague star is cyclical, and it's out of balance, and it's been creating mass extinctions. That's because the Ecological Engineering Corps, that's the original group that created this ship that was in a big battle with the Harangans. It gets knocked out of orbit because of war. And now, Jack, you had a couple ideas about this.
Well, we're going to put a link in the notes afterwards. The whole idea of comets being just in general some sort of heavenly messenger of doom, or that's all over history. The historical imagery of eclipses being assigned from God and that kind of thing, and that's all over real world history and fictional history, and that is going to be a temptation to do analysis of something like this. Is we could play trope whack-a-mole all night with other works, but what can we distill down to? The key takeaway of this is, well, how does George think about these things? How is he using these things? And then what can we get out of that to apply to other stories that he's written? In the Dragon Riders of Pern series, there's a star that comes back periodically and brings great devastation and desolation, and the human society works around it. In this particular case, there's some things that we should take away about, and we'll get into this more as we go on, about this is a consequence of the wars. This is a desolation. This means the setting for this story is the aftermath of something that happened prior. So this is very much in the vein of like the Osmandius poem that he uses. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair, and
yes.
This is like a shy. This is one of those places where this is what's left over when people go to somewhere where the Game of Thrones was played. This is the desolation where people have to. This place is. I don't even want to call it a planet, because it's almost like it's more constrained than that. This is just a place of desolation and destruction. This is a place of stone and ash. Nothing grows here. Nothing lives here. It's not a healthy ecosystem. Whatever life is there is cutthroat, and it's a zero-sum game where everybody is just clawing out existence at somebody else's failure. It is kind of an arena, and that's what we should take away, because this is kind of like, and I think it's explicitly mentioned, like the cities of Slaver's Bay, is that these aren't healthy cities. These are cities that subsist on slavery. There's no
right.
Without slavery, there's not enough food there to survive. There's not enough natural resources. People can't be healthy and happy. These are places that trade in flesh in exchange for survival. And this world is one of those places. It's one of those desolations. That's the key thing to take away from it.
Yes. And I want to read a few chapters from the beginning. So this whole prologue is set up like it's a recording of like the last dying man in this recorded.
It's what we call found media today.
Right, exactly. So this is the found media of Tuf Voyaging. It says, dusk comes now, for me the last. The sun has sunk beneath the western cliffs, staining the land with blood, and now the twilight eats its way toward me inexorably. The stars come out one by one, but this only star that matters burns night and day, day and night. It is always with me, the brightest thing in the sky, but for the sun. It is the plague star. This day I buried Janelle. With my own hands I buried her, digging in the hard rocky ground from dawn through late afternoon, until my arms were afire with pain. When my ordeal was done, when the last spadeful of this wretched alien dirt had been thrown upon her head, when the last stone had been placed atop her cairn, then I stood over her and spat on her grave. It's all her fault, I told her so, not once but many times as she lay dying, and when the end was near she finally admitted her guilt. Her fault that we came here, her fault that we did not leave when we might have, her fault that she is dead. Yes, no doubt of it. Of her fault that I shall rot unburied when my own time comes, my flesh a feast for the beasts of the dark, and the flyers and night hunters we once hoped to trade with. The plague star twinkles but little, shines down upon the land with a clear, bright light. This is wrong, I told Janelle once. A plague star ought to be red. It ought to glower, to drape itself with scarlet radiance, to whisper into the night hints of fire and blood. This clear white purity, what has it to do with the plague? That was in the first days, when our charter ship had just set us down to open our proud little trade complex. Set us down, and then we moved on. In that time, the plague star was but one of 51st magnitude stars in these alien skies, hard to even pick out. And that time we smiled at it, at superstitions of these primitives, these backward brutes who thought sickness came from the sky. So this is a lot like what we hear with the comet in Ice and Fire. And
he sure does like to start a story with a corpse, doesn't he?
There's
two of the Duncan Egg stories start with them. Oh, look, it's a dead guy.
Right. And Bitterbloom starts almost the exact same way as Duncan Egg, with a dead guy that has to be buried, in this harsh, long night winter because the seasons are out of whack.
Right.
It's
bingo,
drink. That's what we're supposed to do. It's so much of it is just like the dialogue that we get from Ice and Fire for the Red Comet.
Well, and that's very, there's some intersections with the Church of Starry Wisdom, but that opening about looking up and seeing a cold star bringing doom is very, very H.P. Lovecraft. It's the terror from space. It's and I think the red-white thing there is he's trying to make it more horrible because a red star kind of implies anger and war and the god Mars and all of the symbology that goes with that. But the cold white star is just kind of indifferent. Like it's going to kill everybody, but it's not doing it because it's angry or it's conquering. It's just that's what it does. Just everyone's going to die. This is staring into the face of mortality.
Right.
Everything dies.
So I have, just to let everybody know that might not know already, I have this prologue typed out with all of these notes and a whole lot more on my blog under the book club tab. And it's called A Taste of Tuff, or Taste of Haviland Tuff, the prologue. So if we're going through things and it's interesting you and you want to read more, then that's where to find it. So back to this, one of the other interesting things about this story is the narrator even sort of links it back and uses the phrase "in blood and fire," or "fire and blood." Sorry, and that's a phrase that George did not really invent or the usage of for Ice and Fire. He also uses it in Fever Dream, and it has a setting specific but similar context to it, that this is about a war. This is about a battle that's about to happen. And George has said that Ice and Fire is a war story at heart. So,
right. Well, and remember the time where Leaf and Bran are talking, and Leaf says something about, all the giants are almost gone and the children of the forest are diminishing, and Bran says men would not accept this, men would be Roth.
right.
Like that's Fire and Blood versus the cold white inevitability of, accepting the future is just what it is. Like that's a dichotomy that he does a lot.
Okay, so that brings us to, so that's a pretty heavy setup. So then that brings us to this middle section where we actually start to get some mythology of not just this location, but in Martinworld, the Thousand Worlds universe in general. And then he goes on, let's see. He starts in with his recurring theme of scientists ignoring the indigenous folks. Scientists and totally just like Maester Lewin. We love him to death. He's super sweet, but he's not really supportive of these tales of the children, the idea of warging, anything like that. There are larger stories larger theories in the Ice and Fire fandom that Macers in general are trying to suppress these green talents. I sort of kind of buy into that to a degree, because we do see this over and over again. The scientists are ignoring the indigenous
world. Is what
right.
It is. The modern world doesn't care anything for the old ways.
Right. And in my view, this is going to be one of the things that we see as the mark of progress in Ice and Fire is when these two items can come together. Like there's a little bit of truth here and a little bit of truth here, and you have to put it together to like find what the whole meal is.
Right.
Throughout Tuf Voyaging, we see that as well. Like I mentioned in the beginning, George rewrote Tuff to have this higher set of morals. And that's something that he plays with in just about every single Tuff story is what is the right thing to do. And sometimes you get what you ask for, and it's not doesn't play out the way that you think it does. Okay.
Well, in the notes in one of those things that you linked to, he said that he from time to time he thinks about Tuff and other stories, and every time that he saw Conleth on the show, he's like, man, I should write a Tuff story. And
yes.
Remember, Varys says, I serve the realm. He literally is one of those Varys types. At least he thinks he's doing the right thing. He thinks he's serving a higher purpose, which, to the point where that tells you something about Ice and Fire, the world of the Ice and Fire, that we should generally assume that Varys is being truthful with Ned. He's not lying. He thinks he is actually serving a higher purpose, probably, because that's how George uses characters like that. He's not tricking him. There's not a secret agenda there. That's probably actually the most sincere thing that Varys has ever said to anybody.
I tend to think so too. Like, who knows exactly how that was going to play out with Varys once Aegon the Sixth got there, once Sansa gets out of the Veil,
I think those are things that George is going to have problems retconning, but I think he started with the notion of who Varys is he starts with this idea of, well, this is who he is, and then he has to work that into the story with the facts on the ground, and I think he's had some problems with that, like, i.e. the Illyrio subplots have probably been jiggered around a couple different times, that his original thought back in the 90s was probably something very different, but the essence of who the character is the same.
Yeah. And Conleth Hill does physically look, I know he has to shave his head to play Varys on the television show, and he'd have to shave his head here, but he really does. And the way he can portray his mannerisms like I thought that a while ago before I read that quote from George saying that Varys or Conleth Hill would make a good Tuff, and I was like, heck yeah, I could see it totally. So,
Right.
yeah. Speaking of, one of the reasons, and I should have mentioned this, or was supposed to mention this in the beginning, as to why we're all here and doing a reread is they were supposed to. It's been several months, but I can't find any updates over from 2020, but they were supposed to be bringing Tuf Voyaging to a television show. And T. Mickle, who is on George's personal writing staff, she's also working on House of the Dragon. She was supposed to be working on bringing Tuff to screen as well. Tuff has been off and on for years and years and years. So if they are going to bring Tuff to the screen, I hope they think of Conleth. I hope he's interested. But
it's been a little crazy this year.
It's been a little crazy this year, but I trust the person that is supposed to be spearheading the story development of that T. Mickle. So I hope she does. I hope she gets it and she does a great job, and I will watch every single second of it. That was my side rant. Okay, so after this heavy opening, and one of the recurring themes is the scientists ignoring the indigenous folktales. A smaller item is some of the animals that George has in his story. There's one that sticks out in my mind the most is, since we're talking about a war story here, or the beginnings of a war story, and Ice and Fire is a war story, George he throws in this background detail of a sort of pterosaur-like animal that is there on page, and who brought it there, what's it doing there, what's it going to, does it have a future? That's somewhat like the skeleton, that giant skeleton that Bran sees in the cave, but we also have it on the other side with Viserion in the cave. Yeah, that's a small detail. Those are the small details that stick out to weirdos like me.
Well, and I'm thinking, wasn't there, I don't know if it was in the main story, if it was only in the world book, but the idea of the giant bats hanging in Harrenhal?
Yeah.
Somebody said that there used to be man-sized bats that would hang on the walls.
Mm-hmm.
So, it could be that the heraldry of the Wentz with the giant bats was a misunderstanding of something, George is making some allusion to leathery winged
right
werebats or something.
Most definitely has a thing for these ancient dactylid creatures. He uses them a lot.
Well, dinosaurs are awesome.
Yes, they are. But he really likes these leathery wing dactylid. The word just left my brain.
Pterosaurs.
The pterosaurs, but even from Tolkien, the
fell beasts.
The Nazgul. Sorry, the Nazgul dragon type things. I think it may have seeped in from there, or may have seeped in because dinosaurs are just really cool in general. But yeah, in Bitter Blooms he uses them. In Dying of the Light he uses them. I mean, I could go on and on. So the fact that he also has that little detail in Ice and Fire makes me happy.
Right.
Another small detail, something that's easy to sort of read over, that sticks out to me, especially, again, we're talking about characters that have psi-link powers and that are at war. He says, the Flyers die, the great minds, even the Flyers die, which in the context of this prologue, that's kind of like the Bloodraven Green Seers can die. So, and I think, we're going to see that with Bloodraven pretty soon anyway.
Right. Well, and that death is proper. So things like what Bloodraven's doing and the House of the Undying are improper. Those things are out of balance. Again, that's one of the theory. What is the point of the all men must serve, all men must die? I think those they mean the same thing. That even you can serve in a military sense while you're alive, but you can also serve by dying, which is something like Quarter and Half Hand says. If what's the purpose of Night Watch if not to die for others? That dying may be scary, but that it is ultimately it's part of life, and characters that seek to avoid that are doing something bad in George's world.
So I'm going to read this one chapter where it talks about the flyers that die, because the description behind it, you'll see what I mean about Bloodraven, Green Seers, that type of character. It says the flyers die, the night hunters, with their massive twisted limbs and gnarly two-thumbed hands, with their eyes that burn and their bulging skulls like embers from the last dying fire. Ho, they die too. They have a frightening strength, and those strange great eyes can see in the black when storm clouds cover even the plague star. In their caverns, the hunters whisper of the great minds, the masters they once served, the ones who will someday return and call on them to go forth to war once again. Yet the minds do not come, and the night hunters die, even as the flyers, even as those of the more furtive races with bodies we find in the Flint Hills, even as the mindless beast, even as the crops and trees, even as Janelle and I. So there's even a shared line,
Also, Flint Hills.
Yes. There's even this shared line, bulging skulls with, embers from a dying fire. And one of the descriptions we get of Bloodraven in the cave is he looks like his eyes look like the last coal in a dead fire. Is just that his life is fading away to the final death. So
and I wanted to put the quote from Lewin in here because it fits right along. We look at the mountains and call them eternal, and so they seem, but in the course of time, mountains rise and fall, rivers change their courses, stars fall from the sky, go figure, and great cities sink beneath the sea, even gods die, we think, everything changes. This is also like George's inspiration is not really the fascination with like the Jack Vance dying worlds, the festival world in Dying of the Light, just the idea that we're moving through a very temporary life, and no matter what we build, no matter what the monuments are, that everything crumbles, everything falls, everything dies. And I think that is the rhetorical point he's trying to make, and that if you what George thinks is admirable is you can leave a legacy in terms of the people whose lives you have affected. So like that is a thing where Cersei thinks Ned lost because he died and she won, but what you're seeing is that Ned is actually winning the game because he had such a positive effect on the people that he left behind. That their loyalty towards Ned is going to be one of the things that is going to come back to bite the Lannisters. That what matters is what you leave behind, and to the point of, I think that is the secondary meaning that a lot of people skim over when you say the lone wolf dies but the pack survives.
Mm-hmm.
That does mean that the pack supports the individual wolves, but it also means there's a kind of a darker meaning, which is that the pack can survive the loss of one wolf. And not only is it mutual support, but what matters is the pack. And 100 years from now, the pack will still exist, even though it doesn't contain any of the original members from previously. So that to George's personal philosophy about the way things work is we shouldn't, build things or be fixated on things, because he has a well-known sort of existential dread about mortality that he's talked about personally and he has written about. But the characters that are admirable are the characters that are build things that will outlast them, like Abner Marsh and Fever Dream. And the leaving behind, at the end of that story, he's leaving behind a future that will be better, even if his role in it is unknown. Like, that's George's archetype of the unknown hero. And there's some of that in Tolkien, which I'm sure he's read all that stuff, and that's not exclusive to him, but that's clearly an idea that is very important to him. So that gives you a guideline for thinking about characters, whether they're doing good things or they're doing bad things, and whether they succeed or whether they fail. You can extrapolate that pattern and then apply that to other books.
Another story that has that theme very, very strongly is For a Single Yesterday, where where Johnny Winters
go figure.
Johnny Winters is the one that carries on the pack. And it's you can that's how the pack survives, is because of Johnny Winters. That's all I'm going to say on that. I have that story. It's called For a Single Yesterday. I have that one transcribed on my book club page. If you want to go take a look, it's not a terribly long story, but it's a really interesting read, because like every paragraph is just loaded. Yeah. Okay, something else that we are introduced to in this prologue is the idea of the ecological engineering corps, the Theta and the Change Masters. That is something that we will see more of when we get to the story in the House of the Worm, and also more Tuff stories. And to me, like the strongest analog to Ice and Fire is something along the lines of the Empire of the Dawn or the Blood Mages from Valyria that create the dragons. The
flesh pits of Sithorios.
Exactly. These different little cultures from a bygone era that are just messing with genetics, and they're not necessarily trying to create new life like God, but they're trying to create something stronger. They're trying to do some sort of an improvement.
This is sort of like again, this goes to George's personal set of ethics. This isn't really a hubris point, like stories like Stealing the Fire of the Gods and Frankenstein and Prometheus are about, and even the Adam and Eve story are about people reaching for something they shouldn't have because of pride and hubris, and that leads to their downfall. That's not exactly what this is. This is more about, I think it's George's The Three Sources of Power, that people try to, whenever they get a certain sense of power, characters will try to do it for commercial interest, or like in the case of the Steel Angels, they do it for theocratic, fanatical reasons.
Oh, yeah.
But they're basically colonizers. This is like, the modern world goes to a wild place and attempts to modify it somehow for their own benefit, not necessarily for pride, but either for profit, or that's again Seven Times Never Kill Man. They're trying to turn it into a trading colony. The people go to the place, and the place either destroys them or alters them. This is like, in the World Book, we get the backstory about Nath has never been colonized because people would go there to collect slaves, and they die from the butterfly sickness.
Right.
That is, and that the whole notion of Sithorius being this overgrown jungle where essentially nature has fought back and reclaimed those cities, because it always goes astray, I guess is the way to summarize George's thinking. It's not that pride goes before a fall. That's not the story he's telling. He said, whenever you do something, there are always unintended consequences.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we talked a lot about that in Sand Kings as well. And that's
again, you can draw connections. We could be here for hours talking. Right. Oh, well, this is like that story and other George stories and other pieces of science fiction and other pieces of mythology and religion. I think the useful thing to do is to distill it down to, well, this is how George thinks about the world.
Yes.
And I think that is the essence of it, because he does this in almost every story. There's always a consequence, where nature, the hammer of the waters, or whatever it was that happened at Moat Cailin, or the jungles, reclaiming the cities of Sithorius, or the downfall of Old Gis, or whatever happened in Ashai or Valyria. It's the same story over and over. If I'm going to bet, I'm going to say something like this is what happened with Hardhome. Like, it was, oops, we shouldn't have done that. It was one of those stories.
So something else that we're introduced to in this prologue that we will see in more Tuff stories that we see in Ice and Fire are really bizarre sicknesses.
With fun names, like Manthrax.
Oh, man, that's an awesome one. Manthrax is one of my favorites.
Brown leg. Brown leg is the worst.
It's like Willem Darien is wasting sickness, like Araya Targaryen and her fireworms. Like,
he's mentioned the slow plague in several books and not described what it is. But
right.
The point of it is that it's inevitable doom. Like, the symptoms are actually not important. What's important for the story is that the characters have it, it's incurable, and they know they're going to die. Right. This is like HIV in the 80s. It's like, yep, it's just a death sentence, and it's going to take 4 or 5 years, and it's going to be awful the entire time. That's the point.
Right. And this also plays into a little bit of like his wild cards universe that he started as well. Like, what these different things can do to you. Some people survive, they turn into jokers and what. So
I enjoy the fact that even within as short as the story is, that he thinks in the beginning that he's going to die and his body's going to be food for the flyers or whatever. But then when we learn the specifics of his body, he's basically turning to stone and crumbling to ash. So it's not like there's going to be any food left for them anyway. Like, he can't even nourish something else in the act of dying. Right. That's how desolate this place is, that it's not even a world where the flesh of one thing can keep another thing alive. His flesh is basically ruined by this disease that he's got.
Let's see if I can find it really quickly. That one's not it. It's
They never should have come, and he says that explicitly. This was a terrible idea, but we came because we thought we could make money.
And that's what he was, cursing. That's what he was cursing Janelle about. In that harsh beginning. Sorry. I'm trying to look over this. I can't. I'm putting in the wrong quote. Yeah, it says, "Yet then the plague star began to wax. Night after night it burned more brightly. Long before that time, the pestilence had begun." So, and it's interesting that he's counting this time by the phases of the moon as well. Like when the moon was waxing, which occurs between the new moon and the full moon. It changes in appearance. There's a lot of things between Bran and Val and some other people where they're, keeping time with the phases of the moon. Let's see. And then, okay, so we have this harsh opening. We have this graphic middle. And then we start to get to some of the final disasters or final revelations of what is going on in this prologue. It's only 5 pages, so it's a quick read. So everybody should go read it. Right. If not for the rest of Tuff, then at least for the mini story that it is in itself.
It's one of those. You may be wondering how I got here, right? Needle scratch and then a backlog of rewind. It's that right. Shape.
So it's the setup for the story, The Plague Star, and where Tuff gets his seed ship. Tuff was, as I've mentioned before, he was written with the higher set of morals, according to George, which is why in The Plague Star, he wins at the end. Tuff is a lot like Garth Greenhand with his seed ship. It's essentially like Garth's seed bag. It's a euphemism for both planting the earth, but also planting seeds in people, which who knows what genetics Garth Greenhand was spreading, like what sort of hidden talents, like skin changing talents, things like that Garth Greenhand could have possibly been sharing. And so we see the results of this Plague Star ship. So as you should be able to tell by now, the Plague Star is not actually a star. It is a ship that has gone rogue. It's out of orbit because of a war. They this is part of what the indigenous folk were talking about, that was just totally ignored because it didn't appeal to the sciences. It's what nature. It's a clue to the nature of extreme dragons returning in Ice and Fire as well, with the seasons being out of whack. This is all connected. George has even said it was a while ago, but he said that the strange phenomenon of the fantasy world seasons, of the long fantasy world seasons, will be explained in the final volume of the series. So he's
not just freestyling. There's a point.
There is a point. And let's see. Some of what this is foreshadowing, especially towards the end of the Plague Star. Remember, there's spoilers here. Is Rica Dawnstar. She shows up in the Plague Star story itself, and she is very much like Dany. And she might have like the short, choppy hair and whatnot, but she's very much like Dany. She even starts to put on, I forget what it is, but it's like a crown, and it acts as like a like an antenna or something that boosts signal, because she's able to psionically control a T-Rex, and she rides around on T-Rexes.
Because dinosaurs are awesome.
Which you can see why, even on a small level, George put a very probable like dinosaur animal in the menagerie in Bravos, where Dany most likely was, especially after he put Dany into the current Ice and Fire story, not just that little like a mini story where he ended up changing a few things. Let's see. Do you have anything else you want to add to some of these closing themes? I don't want to go on for. Oh, Megicam is here.
It's not like this story is that long enough that we're going to lose track.
Right. Saying hello to her really quickly. So the setup of this story, of this prologue, plays the Plague Star is the longest Tuf Voyaging story, but it's probably one of my favorites. Probably even more than Guardians. Guardians would be my second favorite. But read this short story. It should, whet your appetite a little bit more, and then, we'll go on to the Plague Star. But it's fun. It's a fun read. There's jokes throughout it, even though it's, terrible people doing terrible things. Right. And one of the strongest, heaviest themes is might versus right. Something that we see between people like Stannis and Renly, or Quentin and Arianne. It's about who is air quote worthy of ruling in the end, of playing right. God in the end. And that's
and all the Targaryen succession crises were generally about that. You had someone who was next in line that was terrible, and there was always some better candidate, and that was always the thing that caused a civil war. And a dispute was, do you give it to the Blackfire rebellions? He was the better man.
He has the sword. He was given the sword, but he has like the brains. So which one is it? And
even within the wildlings, there's that kind of The way the wildlings have solved that problem is they've just dispensed with the formality of the blood doesn't matter. Only they will follow strength. They follow competence.
Right.
Which is George winking at you and going, well, that's the way it should be. But over here in the civilized world, we let, the genealogy determine who gets to be in charge of the classism or whatever. And George hates those things. So again, you can discern George's mind, and now you can understand all the things that you're going to see in all the other stories he writes, because that's his politics.
Right. Which, to go off that a little bit, I totally agree with you that it's not about the lineage or genealogy or anything like that, which is why I'm fairly convinced is the reason why Bran is not going to be able to have children. Is he just he cuts out that issue completely. He literally tears it out root and stem. That it's going to be the rule, not, or the leadership, I should say. The leadership is in the style, and who gets to be leader is going to change. So we're not going to have any more of these civil wars over a stinking bloody Iron Throne. So,
and I can riff on that, but that is something we should save till the after party because it doesn't pertain to Tuff at all.
All right. Okay, so that's really the main points about this prologue. It's I forgot to change my banner, but that's all right. So if you do want to read it, like I said, it's a prologue, so it's short. That's where you can find it. My blog, book club tab, A Taste of Haviland Tuff, the prologue. So I have all sorts of information in there, including information about the potential television show this is going to turn into, a few more words from George and how he feels about Tuff in this series. It's even how Tuff got his name. It has to do with chess, which is another huge theme across Martinworld is the chess. It's good it's fun backstory to read from George, but this prologue's really good. It's really
and none of these ideas are unique to this particular story. You're going to, for as long as we do these little things, you're going to continue to hear the same ideas week after week after week, which is the point, that you're extracting the common set of elements that he's reusing, some of which are from mythology, some of which are his unique takes on things.
Yes.
If you missed it this week, come back next week.
Let me just check in over here really quickly. Did you want to... Do you have some staff book picks?
I do. I have a number of things that I won't shut up about.
So share some. Yeah.
Probably maybe not the best book that's ever been written, but it's definitely my favorite book. Watership Down. Everyone should read this. It has all of the things that every good book should have. It has a made-up. Hang on. It has a made-up language with a glossary. Step 1. It has not one but 2 separate maps, which every good book should have a map at the front with.
I was going to say we need maps.
With annotations where key events happen.
Yeah.
And like one of the things that I like about George's writing in general, you get that obviously you get this more in the more real world grounded stuff like Fever Dream, is that it's metatextual. These are stories about stories. So like every chapter in Watership Down begins with a little excerpt of a piece of poetry or a citation from another book, or the great ones of literature. For example, I just made a list because it was fun. He's got everything from the ancients like Agamemnon, Xenophon, Plato, quotes from Gilgamesh. There's an excerpt from the Acts of the Apostles in the Bible and from Psalm 56. There's a quote from Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, some stuff from the personal writings of Napoleon. Shakespeare is quoted extensively, Henry V, Hamlet, All's Well That Ends Well, and Julius Caesar is the head of 2 chapters. He quotes Blake, Tennyson, and Yeats. Dostoevsky, from the Brothers Karamazov, Jane Austen, Lewis Carroll, Joseph Campbell, and Dylan Thomas for good measure. So this is not a children's book.
Yeah.
This is a book written by someone who loves literature and stories. And in the book, that's one of the key points, is that the stories that characters tell themselves and the way they see themselves fitting into those stories is one of the most important things of the experience of being human. So this is not a children's book about rabbits. This is a book about people and a story about stories as a framing device. I yield my time.
Well, these are the books you should give your kids. This is how you get your kids like addicted to reading, you know.
These are not just fun things. These are essays in the why did we invent literature as a species?
Yes.
Like, why does literature exist? These are books about books and what stories mean to people. And George writes in that mode as well. He quotes, Byron, and there are multiple Ozymandias. There's multiple things that are quoted in Fever Dream. That's one of the hallmarks. If you ever read any book, whether it's fantasy or anything else, and there's quotes about other books in it, that's an author you're going to want to pay attention to, because it's very introspective and metatextual, and that's what I'm here for.
So I didn't bring just like one book this time. I brought a book, or a literature concept, I guess you can say, and also to kind of sort of go with the theme of Tuff, which is a collection of short stories.
Exactly.
There's a group. Where's my camera? These are one stories. It's a group. It's a little publishing group. They won all sorts of awards. If you can get a subscription to them, I have these little tiny things like stashed all over the place. What they do is they send you. They're now up to once a month now, and it's like $22 for a year or something like that. They send you all of these little stories written, not just one genre, not just one style of author, but it's a collection of short stories of up and coming authors. And the work that this organization does it's not an organization, but a small group of people, is just absolutely amazing. And they have the best stories in here. So their website is one-story.com. So if you want to look into that, you never know what you're going to get. I have never read a bad story from this collection. And if you're somebody that does like to read across different genres, that's great, because
Sounds like an excellent idea.
Yeah, you can sit down for just a few hours. This story is only 22 pages long. I love this one too.
Well, and that's the thing. I guess the thing to say about George is it's actually harder to write good short stories, than to write longer. And that's why he's struggling, because he really is at home in the short story. He's, all of his, I think, Dying of the Light is not terrible, but it clearly has some pacing issues. He's more comfortable in that kind of, like, you could turn this into a 1 hour Twilight Zone episode. Like, that's about, like, you got a beginning, you introduce some characters, you set up the stage, an action happens, the consequences land, and you move on. If it takes a long, long time to build up, and he has a tendency to kind of wander off in the weeds, and that's where, like, the 5-year gap was just through him. That was, like, exactly the worst thing to happen to him as a writer, is have to.
Well, that literally happened in Dying of the Light. That literally happened. They get lost in the forest for a long time,
looking for the plot.
Right.
Like, what happens next?
So I just want to say that this is officially the end of, like, this part of the show. So if you guys want to hang out and, like, for the after party, I don't know what else to call it, the after party, and ask questions, and we'll chat. And it's not necessarily about Tuff, but I'm sure it'll spring off of Tuff. The after party is going to happen. Thank you guys for showing up, for giving me some of your comments, for hanging out, and in showing some interest in these old stories. That's what we're here for, mainly, is to get you to read and, you know, come together as a bunch of like book nerd lovers. And yeah,
And
so
watch the previous stream if you want more content like this, and
yes, yeah,
watch
the
the
previous
forthcoming ones.
Yes. If you want to know where to find this prologue, it's on my let's call it blog. The previous stream on Sand Kings is on the YouTube channel and also on my blog under the book club tab for Sand Kings. I'm trying to cross-link things so they're easier to find. So thank you for showing up. It's now after party time. Woo! Flashing lights. Woo!
Dance party.
So I'm gonna go back to this comment really quickly from Edgecam. Yes, which is why George excels at prologues. Jeff, this is like what you were saying just a second ago. I have always favored George's short stories more than his longer ones. There's nothing wrong with his longer ones. His longer ones are great.
And I'm sure going into this, he said, man, Dying of Light was a slog. I thought I'd never get that done. So what I'm going to do when he did this Ice and Fire thing, I'm just going to pretend each chapter is a short story. Mm-hmm. And he just mentally psychs himself up for that. And he kind of writes that way anyway. And it's an interesting concept. He's like, man, it doesn't matter how long the book is. I just need to treat it like a short. I can do this. It'll be fine.
Yes. Yeah.
Right now, 20 X years later, like, man, I got to finish that.
And his in Ice and Fire it's like it's another like collection of short stories, and each chapter to me,
it's just much more aggressively cross-linked than his other Thousand World stories, where people would mention worlds. They weren't actually interacting with each other as their stories passed through. It was extremely ambitious, but there you have it.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else from here that I didn't get to. I think I mentioned everything. I think we did good in time this time.
I'm disappointed that you didn't bring up Ozymandias, because that's what that is. Like that moment where he talks about the desolation, about, you know, in this land of stone and ash, and, you know, this look on my works, ye mighty in despair. That was an Ozymandias moment. Like, we should not have come here. This was a terrible mistake.
Well, there's also a lot in common with that scene, and when even the landscape, even the time of day, even the act that's happening when Dany is with her final moments with Drogo, and she's going to smother him. She has him out by the rocks. It's night, it's dark, and she's about to smother him with the pillow. And when she does that, that's like her first step into becoming an independent Khaleesi, not a Khaleesi that's only there because of her husband, like in her own name. And then the next chapter, on when Drogo is on the pyre, he symbolically gives her that whip. And that whip is what, this is going to sound really silly to people, but these are these small idiosyncrasies that George puts into his stories. That whip, yes, when Dany has it, it makes that wop, wop, wop noise. And that's how she controls the dragon at first. And that is exactly the same sound that the Ozymandias ship starts to make, is wop, 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 when the ship starts to figuratively, symbolically consume humans instead of regular trees. And it's actually, the name changes to Ozymandias. So
it would be different if this was a movie and you could see something on screen and you're like, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to read something. And George literally took time to write those sentences. Yes. Like every sound, a car went by and made this noise. Like, that means something. George put that sentence there.
Right.
And when it recurs in every story, you can't help but draw the pattern. We can argue about what it means, but it's clearly intentional.
It means he also something. Yeah.
Well, I've got a whole file set aside of every reference in all of the books to click, 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 and tap, tap, tap. Like Barristan Selmy, when he's angry, when Daenerys is, he doesn't know the whole picture, so Daenerys is going to sell one of the dragons, and he's upset about it. He's tapping his staff on the ground, tap, 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 to express his displeasure. And old Nan with her little needles going click, 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 click. But if you just search for every instances of clicking or tapping and using it as a sign of people's irritation, it's everywhere. I mean, he clearly. Now, that doesn't mean it means something. George is also extremely fond of the phrase, one man in 100. I don't think that has a symbolic meaning. He just likes the way it sounds. It's the same way with food porn. I mean, he just really likes food. It doesn't necessarily mean that the word
bemused or bemusing, I think like 8 times on one page in one of his stories. And I'm like, okay, we get it.
Right. Was this just typo? So sometimes when he started using nuncle, it was because he learned about that from a linguistic perspective and he thought it was neat. So I'm just going to start using that in all the books. It doesn't have a significant meaning. Sometimes the answer is it doesn't mean anything, but it doesn't mean that it's not a pattern. And that's what we're here to pick through and try to sift out what is meaningful and what we can use as a way to intuit. When George says this, what does he mean?
And a little bit more on the little ticky sounds in the skin trade and in bitter blooms. When somebody's going into like a dangerous, sort of fiery themed area, their heels are actually, and in the glass flower as well. Their heels are clicking on the floor.
Right. I think that's when Tywin rides his horse through the throne room too. That's a sign. They can hear his horse clicking up towards the throne. All right. Well, this is his gardener style. He doesn't really. They say just because he doesn't outline his stories doesn't mean he's not planning them. Like the characters have an arc. Like here's a character who's going to die tragically. He may not know the specifics, but he knows that character is going to die tragically. And he just has really well developed ideas of who the characters are. And then he bangs them together and sees what happens. So he may not know exactly how the plot works out ahead of time, but he knows who the characters are, which is the opposite of something like, to use the example that people pick on a lot, is a show like Lost, where the characters don't have a lot of internal integrity, that the writers are starting from, okay, well, we want a scene where this happens, and then they work backwards and then make the characters do the choices that causes that scene to happen. And the Game of Thrones kind of did this as they veered away from George's writings, that they need a scene where this happens. So characters would do things which were not in keeping. They didn't have internal integrity. Like a character may be, this character totally hates this, but then they're going to do this. So they love their family, but they're going to kill their family. Because why? I don't know. And that annoys people because the characters are behaving in unpredictable ways. The writer is supposed to teach the reader about who the characters are, and then those characters are supposed to proceed through the story in ways that are consistent with things that character would do or would not do.
Right. And it's also like, even if the scary person or scary whatever is not the person doing the walking, doing the clicking, it sets the scene. It's like, okay, this is my scary scene now.
Right. There's always tension, like the clicking, tapping.
Right. Another odd.
I don't know if somebody told him that, like when he was 22, somebody said, "Oh, that's a great way to build tension and suspense, is you have a lot of noise, like a tapping noise in a scene." I don't know that it means anything, but it's clearly habitual. He does it all the time. So we should say whenever we see that, George wants us to feel this way.
It could be something that he picked up from his own experience, especially being a young boy in the era that he grew up in, where
maybe he just hates that sound. Like the sound of people clipping their fingernails drives him insane, so he works it into the story. I don't know.
Right, yeah. It's like parents or teachers or maybe a clergy at church or somebody.
Right, somebody
don't know how to deal with these. Yeah, exactly. Don't know how to deal with these little boys, that are fidgety. So he could be drawing totally at this. I'm totally speculating. He could be drawing on his own experience at this.
Well, but we don't need to know what the root cause is
bad.
To say, well, this is clearly a thing he's doing. And you can see that We said in the Sand King stream where he refers to a wand spraying insecticide as a misty sword. Like, that's so George. Like, I don't know. That it's completely unnecessary to that story, and there's no second part to that story, but that's absolutely George being George. And
like,
we don't necessarily have answers, but we have patterns. Like, this is why we're here to kind of crash ideas off of each other and try to figure out if this is a pattern, is it valid? Does it occur anywhere else, and how does it usually end? And then try to apply that to the stories we do have and extrapolate.
There was something else in here. I'm going to take a second and I'm not going to be able to find it quickly enough, I think. This is sort of it. I talked about this a little bit. We talked about this a little bit earlier with even the flyers die. That comes after that comes because of the interregnum, this big double war. Oh God, but I'm starting to lose my train of thought. Let's see, the flyers that die. You will walk, but you will fly. The rebuilding, a lot of his rebuilding of worlds has to do with flight returning. That is what happens after the interregnum. That's how you know that society is going to go back to normal. Not just go back to normal, but advance a little bit. And that's something that we see him play with in Windhaven as well. With the society progresses when more people can become flyers, when more people have access to the woodwing school, and that even the flyers that die, the might versus right in here, and who's worthy of what. That's also a lot like the wings that are in Windhaven. That's a lot like Dawn. It's all these things that are associated with flight and rebuilding.
And that line, just the way the sentence is structured, I don't know if this is intentional, but it definitely makes me think of that H.P. Lovecraft line about that is not dead, which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die.
Right.
Like, is this his response to that? He's like, no, you're wrong, dude. Everything dies. Like the point of H.P. Lovecraft is there are certain things that are eternal, is the point of that.
Mm-hmm.
And George always, and another thing, like a very Georgism, is that he always writes in response to something. So like he said that Beric or Lady Stoneheart coming back from the dead was kind of his response to Gandalf coming back essentially unchanged. Like, he's like, no, that's how it would be. It would be like this. Or a thing that we've talked about offline is that he, in every one of his vampire stories, his werewolf stories, his dragon stories, there's always a scene where one of the characters basically trash talks every other, like in Skin Trade, he's like, oh, all that stuff you've heard about werewolves, and that's all nonsense. That's ridiculous. And the same thing's in Fever Dream. Oh, you've heard all these stories about vampires, about we can't look in mirrors. That's all nonsense. And Tyrion has the same thing about dragons in A Dance with Dragons. We saw all this nonsense about dragons sitting on piles of gold and dragons having 6 legs. What a bunch of nonsense. That's all ridiculous. So I don't know if that line is George, like, it's just the shape of the sentence, the way it's paced, sounds a lot like that H.P. Lovecraft line, and I don't know if that's him kind of poking at him a little bit or not.
I think so. That to me sounds very much like what he derived the Greyjoy house words from. Mm-hmm. And I think that applies mostly to Euron and Theon. And their arcs with what they want. I will say that George has very specifically said that when he developed the Steel Angels, or the concept, well, he took the name Steel Angels from a song. Imagine that. Um, Chris
Christopherson.
Sorry, song. I was getting tongue tied there.
Okay.
He took the name Steel Angels from one of his songs, but the whole concept, like the building of them, he said he wrote an answer to Gordy Dixon's The Dorsai. I have all of this on the all of this information, if you want, is on the And Seven Times Never Kill Man reread page. But yes, he most certainly does write in response to things. Oh, you should hear him. You should. There's this funny video where it's a short video where he is responding to, he's talking about Fever Dream, his vampire story. And somebody brings up sparkly vampires from a very popular
other crappy vampire.
Right. And his response to that was just so measured and so polite, but man, it was like one of those, I heard there's a term for it, one of those ways where it's an insult, but it's like nicely.
Well, he's really in his element with like passive aggressive shade. Like, yes. Understated sassy. Yeah.
So, well, do you have anything else for right now? There's it's not much more I can think of at the moment right now, besides for people to go read.
Right.
That's the homework.
We're gonna. I don't know if you'd already put it there or not, but the link to there's a Wikipedia article about comets in fiction, all the various tropes of that, and Lucifer's hammer and Hammer of the Gods and Knight of the Comet and Dragon Riders of Pern and on and on and on and on.
I mentioned it. I mentioned it, but this is what we were talking about before in notes.
Good list to start from if you want to think more about that.
Right. Yeah. So comets in fiction. So if you want to read a little bit more about the plague star or symbolism, which is also the Volcran, which is also the red comet, there's probably something in some other story I can't think of right now. Yeah, some sort of.
There's some stuff, I don't know if we'll get into this and other things, but the whole idea of, I think you might have said this on Twitter, that the Quaith's mask is a mask of stars. Yeah. Like that's a very H.P. Lovecraft thing, that voice coming to you, which, yeah, I am of the opinion that Quaith is probably not there to help. Like she's, if she's even a real person and it's not like a voice of some elemental force or something, there's a lot there. That again, it's very H.P. Lovecraft, Church of Starry Wisdom. The pinpoints of light burning bright with their hatred of man upon earth or whatever. There's Quaith is not fully fleshed out. It's not a great character. But I kind of think that is going to pay off some point later, especially since it's intersects with Danny's stuff. And I think Danny's arc slows down in A Dance with Dragons because, now we're talking about politics, and that's not what that character is for. There's a lot of filler there because the timelines didn't match up, so she's spending more time dealing with political issues.
Yeah.
And it's, another chapter of this. I know a lot of people don't like Karth, but I think that there's stuff that it may feel forced when it comes out later, but there is stuff that happens in Karth that is the grenade hasn't gone off yet. Mm-hmm. That those things will be important later in her arc. So I am looking forward to kind of seeing that.
I think I think Quaith is going to pay off kind of like how Woe Jallowo did from Sand Kings. That we'll see her again, and she was like, "Look, I was trying to tell you one thing, one way, and you went this way. I said zig, you said zag, and now you've got there's some consequences to pay."
All right.
So I think I think Quaith will have a role similar to that, some sort of like star guide.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's in this story, the plague star is actually like compared to a white star. It's just brighter than the other stars.
Yeah.
The idea of a red comet, the slash across the sky, is one kind of celestial thing. People looking at the moon, and the moon is kind of like, it acts like a psychic reflector. Like there's a period where John is looking up at the moon thinking about Arya, and Arya is looking up at the moon thinking about John, and this is happening at the same time. And it's not like they're directly communicating, but they kind of get a sense of what the other is doing, at least in a literary sense. Like the moon is a kind of celestial thing, but it's different than stars. And Quaith is definitely a queen of stars of some kind. I don't know what that means, but I think it wasn't just a thing that he just dropped in there. She could have just been a misty voice from somewhere, but George specifically wanted to hang that, and her face was a mask of stars imagery off of her, and I think that's going to pay off somewhere.
Well, to bring it back to the Tuf Voyaging thing, there is the short paragraph where he says, "I will sit here in the coolness and talk my thoughts to this crystal, and I would drink my wine and watch the flyers, the few who still live, as they dance and soar against the night. Far off they look like shadow gulls above my living sea. I will drink wine and remember how the sea sounded when I was a Boudicca boy who dreamed of stars. And when the wine is gone, I will use the flamer." So, yeah,
that sounds like the ending of Tower of Ashes.
It does.
That sounds like the what's the protagonist in the Stone City, where he's a boy looking up at the sky, dreaming about going to all the stars. Like,
yes,
sing along if you know the words, right?
Right. Yeah, and in that one, and in Stone City, his father even gets a thrill out of when his father has these parties, like showing off how his son, his child son, can name everything.
Which Bran does. Mm-hmm. Right, so like the wall is like the sky, and the castles along the wall are like, it's a river, it's a sea, it's the sky, and the castles along the wall are like stars in the sky. And so Bran, Benjen brags about how Bran knows the names of all the castles. He recited them all east to west, west to east.
Yes.
Same thing. He knows all the names of all the stars in the sky.
Hey, I won a trivia one night by being able to do that. I can't do it now, but I
the castles or the stars?
No, all the 19 castles along the wall. I was able to name them all in order, and I can't do that now, but I did that night, and I won trivia.
Okay. Well, you get one internet point. There you go.
Oh, let me get back and check it on comments real quickly. All right, for anybody watching, I'm sorry, but this app doesn't really show me comments everything the same way that YouTube does. So, Magicamp says Quaith is the red star, and that, the sun stars dichotomy. So, all right, well, we're going to about an hour and a half right now. I think that's probably about good at the moment, just because this is a really short, 5-pager. So, Night Flyers should be out over the next 2-3 days. I am so
before TWOW.
Before it will be out before. Yes, it will be out before TWOW, and I would not be upset if it wasn't out, or if TWOW somehow came out first. But anyway.
And anybody with strong opinions about that sees the stream prior to that, get in touch.
Yeah. So if you know Night Flyers, get in touch. It's a great story. I just watched the movie, the 1987 movie again, like two 2 nights ago, I think.
Well, did you see the person that tweeted that link that you
I did.
tweeted today was the
Right.
woman that was in it?
Yes.
Who was also in Night of the Comet.
Yes. Yeah. And she did a great job in the movie for what she was given.
Right.
She's not the way... She's actually very close. There's so many... Whoever... The whole... That's... I don't even know where to start. That movie didn't get great reviews, and it's kind of mocked nowadays. But if you know Martinworld stuff and you watch that movie, it's actually very close to the story. Yes, they had to like condense some elements.
Which is a problem because George stories are...
Well, yeah, I don't know how well they...
tidy.
Yeah. I mean, but even in the beginning where the Caroli DeBrannon character, they changed all the names to everybody, except for Roy Darris. The Caroli DeBrannon character, he doesn't even say it, but you see the notes that he's writing down, and he's talking about Old Poseidon. Old Poseidon has nothing to do with that movie. It has to do with Martinworld. So somebody knew like the source, the true source material.
There was at least one person in the room who cared about the original.
Right. And I mean, there's even phrases like, okay, so now are we going to go fight the dragon? And that story doesn't exist in the book. Or I'm sorry, that line doesn't exist in the book, but that's what the symbolism of the ship is for many reasons. But I will talk about that next time for Night Flyers. So, it's an interesting story, and I already have the link in that post. So if you want to watch it, just give me a few days and it'll all be up together if you want. So, all right. Okay, well, I'm going to say that is probably enough for this evening. Short prologue, you know where to find it. And then Night Flyers is next. And then we'll do some more Tuff because Tuff is so long. It's going to have to be broken up. But I've been dying to get to Tuff for a long time. So, yeah. In the meantime, you can find my Catterday Tuf Voyaging stuff every Catterday Saturday. So, all right. Well, thank you guys for being here and hanging out. Shadowjack, thank you again for indulging me. And I will see everybody later. All right, good night.
See ya.